Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing how far and at what moments of the day or night these documented accounts reach. In the spring of 1940, the Hartwell family arrived in Blackwater, Missouri, a township of fewer than 300 residents situated along the eastern banks of the Blackwater River, approximately 18 miles southwest of Boonville, in Cooper County. The house they inherited sat at the end of Hickory Ridge Road, a narrow dirt path that wound through dense oak and hickory forest before terminating at a clearing where the two-story structure stood, its weathered clapboard siding the color of ash. The nearest neighbor lived more than 2 miles to the north. County records indicate the property consisted of 47 acres, most of it wooded, with a small apple orchard gone wild on the southern edge. Thomas Hartwell, age 38, had received the deed through his uncle's estate. The uncle, a man named Silas Crenshaw, had lived alone in the house for 23 years before passing away in a Kansas City hospital in January of that year. According to the probate inventory filed at the Cooper County Courthouse, the house contained minimal furnishings, a bed frame, a kitchen table with 2 chairs, and several wooden crates. There was no mention of personal effects. Silas had no other living relatives. The will was straightforward. Everything went to his sister's son, Thomas, who had met his uncle only briefly in earlier years. Thomas arrived with his wife, Eleanor, age 34, and their 2 daughters, Margaret and Ruth, ages 22 and 19, respectively. They came from St. Louis, where Thomas had worked as a bookkeeper for a manufacturing firm that had recently closed. The move to Blackwater represented both an inheritance and a necessity. They had little choice but to accept the property. The first month passed without incident. According to a letter Eleanor sent to her sister in St. Louis, dated April 23, 1940, the house was larger than expected, but showed signs of neglect. The floors sagged in places. The kitchen pump drew water that tasted of iron. The walls were bare except for rectangular discolorations where pictures or mirrors had once hung. She described the silence as oppressive, particularly at night, when the only sounds came from wind moving through the trees and the occasional groan of settling timber. The attic remained unexplored during those first weeks. Access required pulling down a wooden ladder from a trapdoor in the ceiling of the upstairs hallway. The door itself was painted shut, the edges caked with layers of old paint that had hardened over years, perhaps decades. Thomas mentioned it to Eleanor only once, suggesting they would address it eventually. There seemed no urgency. The house offered adequate space on its 2 main floors. It was Margaret, the elder daughter, who brought it up again. She had been assigned the smaller of the 2 upstairs bedrooms, the one that faced east toward the forest. In a diary entry dated May 7th, discovered years later among her belongings, she wrote that she heard sounds from above her ceiling at night. Not footsteps exactly, more like shifting weight, something settling. She mentioned it to her mother, who attributed it to animals. Squirrels or raccoons, Eleanor suggested, were common in old houses. They would need to seal the gaps eventually. But the sounds continued. Margaret's diary entries became more frequent. May 10th. Again last night, a dragging sound like something being pulled across a wooden floor. May 14th. I asked Ruth if she heard it. She said no, but her room is on the other side of the house. May 17th. Mother says I'm imagining things, but I'm not. It's always between midnight and 2 in the morning, always the same pattern. Drag, pause, drag. Thomas finally agreed to open the attic on May 21st. He did so primarily to put Margaret's mind at ease, according to what he later told a county deputy. He retrieved a scraping tool from the shed and spent the better part of an afternoon working the paint free from the trapdoor's edges. When the seal finally broke, a rush of stale air descended into the hallway, Eleanor, who stood watching from the doorway of the master bedroom, later described the smell as similar to old paper and dust, but with an underlying note she couldn't quite identify. Something organic, something that had been closed away for a very long time. The ladder, when pulled down, proved sturdy despite its age. Thomas climbed first. He carried a kerosene lamp, as the attic had no electric lighting. The house itself had been wired for electricity only partially, with service reaching just the kitchen and main floor parlor. The upstairs bedrooms still relied on lamps and candles. What Thomas found was space. A long, unfinished attic that ran the entire length of the house, perhaps 40 feet from one gabled end to the other. The ceiling sloped sharply on both sides, following the roof line. Exposed rafters crossed overhead. The floorboards were rough-cut pine, darkened with age. Dust covered everything, but there were gaps in that dust, paths almost, places where something had moved recently enough to disturb the decades of accumulation. Thomas called for Eleanor to bring another lamp. When she climbed up, bringing Margaret with her, they saw what he had seen. The attic was not empty. Against the far wall, beneath the western gable, sat a narrow bed frame. No mattress, just the frame itself, made of iron painted white, though rust had eaten through in several places. Beside the bed stood a small wooden chair, and on that chair sat a stack of notebooks, their covers warped from moisture and time. Eleanor picked up the topmost notebook. The cover bore no title. She opened it carefully, the binding cracking as the pages separated. The handwriting inside was small, precise, and dense. The first entry was dated June 3rd, 1897. They brought the notebooks downstairs. There were 9 in total. Some were nearly full. Others contained only a dozen pages of writing before the entries stopped abruptly. The handwriting varied in consistency. In the earlier notebooks, the script was controlled, almost mechanical in its regularity. In the later ones, particularly the last 2, the writing became erratic. Lines slanted upward or downward across the page. Words were misspelled or repeated. Some passages were illegible. The notebooks appeared to be a journal, though they contained no personal reflections in the conventional sense. Instead, they recorded observations, daily weather, sounds heard from below, counts of various things, boards in the floor, nails visible in the rafters, hours of daylight visible through a small gap in the western gable wall. The writer never identified themselves by name. The entries referred to the writer only as I, and to others only as they or them. One entry from July 1899 read, "They have forgotten again. 3 days now. The cup sits empty." I counted the hours by watching the light move across the floor. 22 boards separate the window gap from the eastern wall. I have counted them 412 times. Another, undated but appearing in the third notebook, read, "A voice today. Through the floor. A woman's voice. She was singing." I tried to remember the melody, but it faded too quickly. When I closed my eyes, I could almost see her, but when I opened them, there was only the chair and the bed and the dark rafters overhead. Eleanor read through the night. Thomas joined her. They sat at the kitchen table with the notebooks spread before them, working through the entries by lamplight. Margaret stood in the doorway watching. Ruth had gone to bed, claiming exhaustion, though Margaret would later write that her sister seemed frightened by something she wouldn't name. The picture that emerged was fragmentary but consistent. Someone had lived in that attic, not visited, lived, for years, based on the span of dated entries. The final entry appeared in the 9th notebook and was dated March 2nd, 1917. It read, "I no longer hear them. Perhaps they are gone. Perhaps I am gone. The distinction has become unclear." There was no signature, no name, no indication of who had written the words or why they had been in the attic in the first place. But certain details recurred throughout the journals, references to a door that never opened, mention of food left on the stairs, Though the notebooks never specified what kind of food or how often it appeared, descriptions of cold in winter and heat in summer, suggesting the attic had no proper insulation, and in several entries, references to punishment for making noise. They said I was too loud. Now there is no cup. Now there is only waiting. Thomas sat back from the table as dawn light began to fill the kitchen. He looked at Eleanor. According to what she later told her sister, his expression was difficult to read. Not quite fear, more like recognition of something he had hoped to avoid. He said they would need to speak with someone in town, someone who might know the history of the house, someone who could explain what they had found, but Blackwater, Missouri, in 1940 was not the kind of place where questions were encouraged. The township had no dedicated law enforcement. A county deputy visited twice monthly, primarily to check on property disputes and ensure no illegal stills were operating in the surrounding hills. The nearest newspaper was printed in Boonville and covered only major events. Local history was preserved informally through conversations and family stories, most of which remained private. Eleanor's sister, in a letter dated June 2, 1940, asked directly, "Have you reported what you found? Surely someone must know what happened in that house." Eleanor's response, if she sent one, was never preserved. What is known from later testimony is that Thomas did speak with several long-time residents of Blackwater. He asked about Silas Crenshaw. He asked about the house's previous owners. He asked if anyone remembered unusual circumstances or disappearances in the area around the turn of the century. The responses he received were variations on the same theme. Silas kept to himself. The house had a reputation for being unlucky, though no one could specify why. Several families had owned it before Silas purchased it in 1917. Records were incomplete. People moved away. Memories faded. One elderly man, identified in a later statement only as a resident of the township for more than 60 years, suggested that Thomas should leave the past where it belonged. "Some things," he said, "you don't improve with examination." Thomas seemed to accept this advice, at least outwardly. He stored the notebooks in a trunk in the master bedroom. He nailed the attic trapdoor shut using 6 large nails driven through the frame into the surrounding ceiling joists. Eleanor mentioned in a letter to her sister that they had decided not to discuss the matter further. "We have to live here," she wrote. "We have nowhere else to go. Whatever happened is finished. We can only move forward." But moving forward proved more difficult than anticipated. Margaret's diary entries, which had stopped briefly after the attic was opened, resumed in early June. The sounds, she wrote, had not ceased. If anything, they had intensified. Now she heard not just dragging, but also something that might have been tapping, rhythmic, deliberate, as though someone were knocking on wood from the other side. On June 12th, Margaret wrote, "I went upstairs this afternoon while everyone was outside. I stood in the hallway and looked at the trapdoor. The nails are still there, 6 of them. But I swear I heard something from above. Not an animal. Animals don't make patterns. This was a pattern. 3 taps, pause, 2 taps, pause, 3 taps again." She told no one. Her diary entries suggest she believed she would not be believed. Her mother had already dismissed her earlier complaints. Her father had sealed the attic. To bring it up again would invite ridicule or worse, the suggestion that she was becoming unstable. So she kept silent. She counted the sounds. She noted them in her diary, and she began, in her own way, to deteriorate. By July, Eleanor noticed the change in her daughter. Margaret had grown thin. She rarely spoke at meals. She spent hours in her room with the door closed. When Eleanor asked if something was wrong, Margaret said only that she wasn't sleeping well. The heat, she claimed, the unfamiliar surroundings. She would adjust eventually, but she didn't adjust. In August, Thomas found her standing in the upstairs hallway at 3 a.m, staring at the sealed trapdoor. She didn't respond when he called her name. He had to physically guide her back to her bedroom. The next morning, She claimed to have no memory of the incident. Sleepwalking, Eleanor suggested. A phase. It would pass. It didn't pass. On August 24th, Margaret left the house. She took nothing with her except the clothes she was wearing. Eleanor discovered her absence at breakfast and immediately alerted Thomas, who searched the property and the surrounding woods. There was no sign of her. The county deputy was notified. A search party formed. For 3 days, men from Blackwater and the neighboring townships combed the forest and checked along the riverbanks. They found nothing. On the 4th day, Margaret returned. She walked up Hickory Ridge Road just after dawn and entered the house through the front door, which Eleanor had left unlocked. She was unharmed. Her clothes were dirty but intact. She offered no explanation for where she had been. When pressed, she said only that she had needed to walk. She had walked for a long time. She couldn't remember exactly where. The deputy questioned her briefly but found no evidence of wrongdoing. She offered no clear account of her whereabouts, but there was no legal obligation for her to do so. He advised the family to keep a closer watch and left. Eleanor's sister received a letter dated September 3rd. In it, Eleanor admitted she was frightened. "Margaret is not the same," she wrote. "She speaks very little. She spends hours sitting in her room doing nothing. When I ask her what she's thinking about, she looks at me as though I've asked a question in a foreign language. Thomas believes she is having some kind of nervous episode. He wants to take her to a physician in Boonville, but she refuses to go." The letter continued. "I keep thinking about those notebooks, about the person who wrote them. I keep wondering if they were trapped in a situation they couldn't escape. I don't know what happened in this house, but I feel it around us all the time now, like a presence we can't see but can't ignore either. Thomas says I'm being irrational. He says we need to focus on practical matters. But I can't stop thinking about that last entry. Perhaps I am gone. What does that even mean?" What it meant would not become clear for several more years. But by autumn of 1940, the Hartwell family had already begun to fracture under the weight of something they could neither name nor escape. The winter of 1940 into 1941 brought snow to Cooper County earlier than usual. By November, Hickory Ridge Road became nearly impassable. The Hartwells remained isolated on their property for weeks at a time. Thomas made occasional trips to town for supplies, walking the 2 miles to the nearest maintained road where he could sometimes catch a ride with a farmer heading toward Boonville. Eleanor and his daughters stayed at the house. During this period, the documentary record becomes sparse. Eleanor's letters to her sister stopped entirely after October. Whether this was due to the difficulty of posting mail during winter or some other reason remains unclear. What is known comes primarily from later accounts, particularly from Ruth, the younger daughter, who lived until 1960 and gave several interviews in the final years of her life. According to Ruth, the winter months were defined by silence, not merely the absence of sound, but something more oppressive, a quality of quiet that seemed to absorb noise rather than simply lack it. Conversations at meals became brief and functional. Margaret rarely left her room. Thomas spent hours in the parlor, reading the same newspapers over and over, though Ruth noted he never seemed to actually absorb any information from them. Eleanor maintained the house, but did so mechanically, moving through tasks without expression or comment. The sounds from the attic continued. Ruth admitted in a 1958 interview preserved in the County Historical Society's archives that she had lied when Margaret first asked if she heard them. She had heard them from the beginning. Everyone had. But speaking about them felt dangerous in a way she couldn't articulate. It was like acknowledging something that we all agreed to pretend wasn't real, she said. And once you admitted you heard it, you had to explain it, and there was no explanation that didn't make everything worse. In February of 1941, something changed. Ruth described waking one night to find Margaret standing at the foot of her bed. The room was dark except for moonlight coming through the window. Margaret was speaking, but not to Ruth. She seemed to be answering questions that only she could hear. Ruth recalled fragments of the one-sided conversation. "Yes, I understand. No, they won't listen. I tried to tell them. I tried." Ruth pretended to be asleep. Margaret eventually left the room. The next morning, Ruth said nothing about the incident. Neither did Margaret. They sat at breakfast in silence while Eleanor served oatmeal, and Thomas read a week-old copy of a Kansas City newspaper. The routine continued as though nothing had happened, but things were happening. Small things. Objects moved from where they had been placed. A kitchen knife appeared on the floor of the upstairs hallway. A chair in the parlor was found turned to face the wall. Eleanor's hairbrush went missing and was later discovered in the coal cellar, placed carefully in the center of the dirt floor. When Eleanor asked if anyone had taken it, no one answered. Thomas began sleeping in the parlor. He told Eleanor it was because his back troubled him, and the sofa provided better support than their bed. Eleanor didn't challenge the explanation, though Ruth noted that her mother's expression suggested she knew the real reason. Thomas was afraid, not of anything specific, just afraid in a general pervading way that made the upstairs feel intolerable. Spring came late that year. March brought rain instead of warmth, turning the roads to mud and the yard around the house into a sodden expanse of dead grass and exposed earth. It was during this time that Eleanor found the second set of notebooks. She had been cleaning the cellar, a task she had put off since their arrival. The cellar ran beneath the kitchen and was accessed through a narrow door in the pantry. Stone walls, dirt floor, shelves lined with empty jars from previous occupants. Eleanor was removing these jars, intending to clean them for use, when she noticed a gap in the stonework of the eastern wall. Not a gap exactly, more like a deliberate recess, roughly 2 feet square, that had been covered with a thin wooden panel. The panel came away easily. Behind it sat 3 more notebooks, identical in size and binding to those found in the attic, but these were older. The covers had degraded more severely. When Eleanor opened the first one, the pages crumbled at the edges. The handwriting was different from the attic journals, larger, less controlled, and the content was not a series of observations, but rather a kind of record, a ledger. Each entry followed the same format: a date, followed by initials, followed by a brief note. The dates ranged from 1879 to 1896. The initials appeared to represent different individuals. The notes were terse. Arrived from St. Louis. Removed after 7 weeks. Relocated to other arrangements. Family notified of alternative placement. Eleanor brought the notebooks to Thomas. They sat at the kitchen table again, as they had with the attic journals. This time, Margaret joined them. She had emerged from her room without being called, as though she had somehow known what Eleanor had found. The implications were difficult to ignore. The house, it seemed, had served some function in the years before Silas Crenshaw purchased it. What that function was remained unclear from the ledger alone, but certain patterns emerged. Most entries involved individuals staying for varying periods. Stays ranged from a few weeks to several months. Many ended with notation of completion or resolution. Some ended with no notation at all, just a dash where an outcome should have been recorded. One entry, dated November 1896, read, "E.M. arrived from Kansas City, age unknown, condition deteriorated, placement unsuccessful, retained indefinitely." Below this, in different ink and shakier handwriting, someone had added, "Moved to upper room, March 1897. Margaret pointed to the entry. She said nothing, but her meaning was clear. The person who wrote the attic journals, the person who had lived in that unfinished space for 20 years, counting boards and waiting for cups of water, had first arrived in November of 1896. Whatever the house had been, whoever had operated it, They had kept someone there until at least 1917, and then that person had simply ceased to write, ceased to be, perhaps. Thomas went to town the following day. He visited the county clerk's office in Boonville and requested records related to the property. What he found was a history of ownership that changed hands frequently. Between 1875 and 1917, the house had been owned by 5 different individuals or entities. Each ownership period lasted no more than 8 years. The longest was a family named Pritchard, who held the deed from 1879 to 1895. The shortest was a man named Edmund Voss, who owned it for less than 2 years before selling to Silas Crenshaw in 1917. None of the transfers were accompanied by detailed sale documents. Property changed hands. Money changed hands. The records noted only the legal minimums. Thomas asked the clerk if there were any additional documents, anything that might explain the nature of the property during those years. The clerk, an older man who had worked in the office since 1928, said he remembered talk about the house. Nothing specific, just that it had been involved in something irregular, a private facility of some kind, for people who needed to be kept away from public view. That was how it had been described to him, though he emphasized he had no direct knowledge and couldn't confirm anything officially. Thomas returned to the house with this information. He shared it with Eleanor and Margaret. Ruth, who was present for this conversation, recalled that her father seemed almost relieved to have some kind of explanation, even one as vague and troubling as this. He wanted it to make sense, she said in her 1958 interview. He wanted there to be a reason that didn't involve anything supernatural or impossible. So he accepted the idea that the house had been used to hide people away, to deal with problems that families didn't want to acknowledge publicly. But accepting this explanation didn't make living in the house easier. If anything, it made things worse. The weight of what might have happened there, the accumulated suffering of people who had been brought to that isolated place and then removed or forgotten or simply absorbed into the silence, seemed to press down on everything. Eleanor began having headaches. Thomas developed a persistent cough that no amount of rest seemed to cure. Margaret withdrew further into herself, spending entire days in her room without eating. In May of 1941, Ruth woke to find her sister gone again. This time, the disappearance lasted only one night. Margaret returned at dawn, walking up from the direction of the forest. Her clothes were damp with dew and dirt-stained. She said she had been walking through the night. When Eleanor asked why, Margaret didn't elaborate. After that, Margaret began to speak about the attic journals differently. She referred to the writer as though she knew her personally. She didn't understand what was happening when they brought her here, Margaret told Ruth one afternoon. By the time she did, it was too late. Ruth asked how Margaret knew this. The journals hadn't specified such details. Margaret just looked at her and said, "I know." The family began to fracture more visibly. Thomas talked about selling the property, but there were no buyers. The country was moving toward war. Resources were limited. A house with a dark reputation in a remote area held no appeal for anyone with better options. They were trapped not by force but by circumstance. In July, Eleanor wrote one final letter to her sister. It was discovered among her sister's belongings after her death in 1959 and eventually donated to the County Historical Society. The letter was brief and lacked the usual pleasantries. It read, "We are leaving. I don't know where we'll go, but we cannot stay here. Margaret is unwell in ways I don't understand and can't help. Thomas won't admit it, but I see the fear in him. This house has poisoned us. Whatever happened here before we arrived has somehow continued through us. I don't believe in ghosts or curses, but I believe in places that remember. This place remembers too much." But they didn't leave. Records show the Hartwell family remained at the property through 1942. Why Eleanor's stated intention never became action is unknown. Perhaps they truly had nowhere else to go. Perhaps the idea of leaving felt as impossible as the idea of staying. What is documented is that by 1943, the family's presence in Blackwater had diminished to the point of near invisibility. Ruth described this period years later as a kind of slow erasure. They stopped attending the small church services held monthly in town. They stopped purchasing supplies from the general store, relying instead on what they could grow or preserve. Thomas stopped making his periodic appearances at the county seat. When a census taker tried to visit in April 1943, he noted in his report that the house appeared occupied, but no one answered his knock. He left a form on the doorstep. It was never returned. The official record of what happened next comes from a deputy's report filed in August of 1943. A resident of Blackwater, concerned about not having seen anyone from the Hartwell family in several months, requested a welfare check. The deputy drove out to Hickory Ridge Road and walked the final distance to the house. He found the front door unlocked. Inside, the house was neat but empty. No food in the kitchen, no clothing in the wardrobes, no personal belongings of any kind. It was as though the family had systematically removed every trace of their presence before departing. The deputy noted this in his report but found no evidence of wrongdoing. People left. Especially during wartime, with men being called to service and families relocating for work, it was not unusual for properties to be abandoned. What the deputy did note, however, was the attic. The trapdoor had been opened. The ladder was down. When he climbed up, he found the space much as Thomas had found it 3 years earlier, the bed frame, the chair. But now there was something else. On the floor, arranged in a careful line, were 9 notebooks, the same ones Eleanor and Thomas had found and then stored away. Someone had brought them back to the attic, placed them there deliberately, as though returning them to where they belonged. The deputy collected the notebooks as potential evidence. They were logged into county records and filed. No further investigation was conducted. The Hartwell family was never located. No missing persons report was filed because, technically, they weren't missing. They had left. The house remained vacant. Silas Crenshaw's heir was eventually identified through additional probate work. A distant cousin in Illinois. The cousin expressed no interest in the property. It reverted to county ownership for unpaid taxes in 1948. No attempts were made to sell it. The county clerk noted in a memorandum that the property was considered unsaleable due to its reputation and remote location. It would remain county property indefinitely unless someone specifically requested to purchase it. No one ever did. Over the following years, the house deteriorated. Windows broke. Shingles fell from the roof. Vegetation reclaimed the yard. Local residents occasionally dared each other to approach the property, particularly around Halloween, but few actually entered. Those who did reported nothing unusual, just an old house falling apart the way old houses do. But the story didn't end with the house's abandonment. In 1953, a historian from the State University researching rural living conditions in Missouri obtained permission to examine county records related to abandoned properties. Among these records, he found the deputy's report from 1943 and the notebooks that had been filed with it. He read them with growing interest. Here, he believed, was a first-hand account of life in extreme isolation during the late 19th century, a valuable primary source. He requested permission to publish excerpts from the journals in an academic paper. The county granted this permission. The paper appeared in a regional history journal in 1954. It included extensive quotes from the attic notebooks, along with the historian's analysis of living conditions for those committed to private care during that era. The paper mentioned the house's location only generally, referring to it as a property in Cooper County without specifying Blackwater or Hickory Ridge Road. But people in Blackwater knew. The details were too specific to mistake. The house that everyone had tried to forget was suddenly being discussed in academic terms. The past that had been allowed to decay quietly was being excavated and examined. Some residents objected. Others simply refused to discuss it. The historian received several unsigned letters suggesting he abandon his research. He ignored them. He had found something he considered historically significant. One person's discomfort didn't outweigh the value of preserving such a detailed account. He made one trip to the property itself in the summer of 1954. He brought a camera. He documented the house's exterior and, using a borrowed ladder, entered through a broken window to photograph the interior. The images he took show a structure in decay, but still recognizable. Wallpaper peeling in long strips, floorboards warped from water damage, and in the upstairs hallway, the trapdoor to the attic, still open as the deputy had left it 11 years earlier. The historian climbed into the attic one final time. He took several photographs. In one, visible in the background, the bed frame still stands against the far wall. In another, focused on the floor, the dust patterns are visible. Paths, as Thomas had seen, places where something or someone had moved with enough regularity to prevent dust from accumulating. Even after a decade of abandonment, those paths remained visible. The historian noted this in his field journal, but offered no explanation. Some things, he wrote, resist interpretation. We can document them, we can photograph them, but we cannot always explain them. He left Blackwater the same day and never returned. His subsequent academic work focused on other topics. The article about the notebooks remained his only publication related to the house or its history. When asked about it years later, shortly before his death in 1959, he said only that some research projects affect you in ways you don't anticipate. That house, he said, made me understand that not everything from the past should be brought forward into the present. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do for those who suffered is to let them remain in silence. But silence, as it turned out, was not something the house permitted easily. In 1956, Ruth Hartwell, now married and living under the name Ruth Caldwell in Springfield, Missouri, received a letter from Cooper County. The letter was from a law office handling the estate of a woman who had died the previous month. The woman had left specific instructions that certain items be sent to Ruth, at an address the woman had somehow obtained. Ruth had not left a forwarding address when her family departed Blackwater 13 years earlier. How this woman had located her was never explained. The items arrived in a wooden crate 2 weeks later. Inside were Margaret's diaries, all of them from the first entries made in St. Louis before the move to Blackwater through the final entry dated July 19, 1943. Ruth had assumed these diaries were lost when the family left the house. She had never thought to ask what happened to them. Seeing them again, feeling the familiar weight of the small books in her hands, brought back everything she had spent 13 years trying to forget. She didn't read them immediately. She placed the crate in her attic, unopened beyond that first look. She told her husband she had received some old family items, nothing important. But over the following weeks, she found herself thinking about those diaries constantly. What had Margaret written in those final months? What had she been thinking? Ruth had been there, living in the same house, sleeping in the room across the hall. And yet she had no real understanding of what her sister had experienced. In September of 1956, Ruth finally opened the diaries and began to read. What she found was a record of dissolution. Margaret's early entries from St. Louis were those of a typical young woman. Observations about daily life, small social interactions, minor concerns and excitements. But after the move to Blackwater, the tone shifted. The entries became more introspective, then darker, then fragmented. By winter of 1941, Margaret was writing things that disturbed Ruth profoundly. References to conversations Margaret claimed to be having, though Ruth knew her sister spent most of her time alone. Descriptions of dreams that seemed too detailed and coherent to be actual dreams. And repeated mentions of someone Margaret called E. E understands what it's like, one entry read. E knows what they do to people here. E has been waiting for someone to listen. Ruth recognized the initial, EM, the entry from the cellar ledger. The person who had arrived in November 1896 and been moved to the upper room in March 1897. The person who had written the attic journals. Margaret had somehow formed an identification with this long-gone individual. Whether this was a psychological response to stress, a manifestation of mental illness, or something else, Ruth couldn't determine. But the diaries made clear that Margaret had stopped seeing herself as separate from the house's history. She had absorbed it, become part of it. The final entries were the most troubling. Margaret wrote about leaving, not the family leaving together, but her leaving alone. "I know where I need to go now," she wrote on July 15, 1943. "E showed me the way. There's a place beyond the property line where the forest opens to the river valley. E found peace there. That's where the silence finally became complete." The last entry, dated July 19th, was a single sentence. "Tonight, when everyone is asleep." Ruth closed the diary. She sat in her Springfield attic with her dead sister's words before her, understanding finally what had happened. Margaret had disappeared into the landscape. Whether she had truly left to find some imagined place of peace, or whether something else had occurred that the family could never speak of, Ruth would never know. The family, unable to cope with Margaret's deterioration and disappearance, unable to explain it to authorities, or even to themselves, had simply left, removed all trace of their presence, disappeared into the American landscape as so many families did during those years, absorbed into larger cities or distant states where no one knew their history. Ruth never spoke about this publicly. The 1958 interview, in which she discussed the house and the journals, made no mention of the diaries or their final entries. When asked directly what happened to Margaret, Ruth said only that her sister had not adjusted well to life in Blackwater and that the family eventually relocated for that reason. It was technically true, just incomplete. But others spoke. In 1958, a journalist working on a feature about abandoned properties in rural Missouri visited Blackwater. He had read the historian's 1954 article and become intrigued by the story. He spent several days in the township, interviewing longtime residents and examining county records. Most people refused to discuss the house. Those who did provided only fragments. Yes, there had been a family. Yes, they had left suddenly. No, no one knew where they had gone. No, there had been no reports of anything unusual. Just another family unable to make a go of it in a difficult location during difficult times. The journalist drove out to Hickory Ridge Road. The house was still standing, though barely. The roof had partially collapsed on the eastern side. Most of the windows were gone. Vegetation had grown up around the foundation, in some places reaching above the first-floor windows. He took photographs. He noted the oppressive quiet of the location. Even with birds and insects making normal forest sounds, there was a quality of stillness that felt unnatural. He did not enter the house. He wrote later, in an unpublished draft of his article, that something about the property discouraged approach, not fear exactly, more like a sense that entering would constitute a violation. Of what, he couldn't say. But the feeling was strong enough that he returned to his car without attempting to go inside. His article, when published, focused primarily on the economic factors that led to property abandonment in rural areas. The house in Blackwater received only a brief mention. "Some properties," he wrote, "carry a weight that extends beyond their physical decay. They become repositories for community memory, holding not just the accumulated years of their existence, but also the unspoken acknowledgement that certain histories are better left unexamined." The house remained untouched through the rest of the 1950s. Occasional curiosity seekers made the trip out to Hickory Ridge Road, particularly after the journalist's article circulated regionally. But none stayed long. None reported anything supernatural or even particularly unusual, just an old house falling apart in the woods. Unremarkable, except for its persistence. In 1960, a county assessor visited the property as part of a routine survey of tax-delinquent land. He was young, new to the position, unfamiliar with local history. He approached the task clinically, measuring the remaining structure, photographing it from multiple angles, noting the degree of deterioration. His report, filed in March of 1960, recommended that the county demolish what remained and sell the land for timber harvesting. The recommendation was never acted upon. The county commissioner at the time, a man who had lived in Boonville his entire life and knew the stories associated with that particular property, simply filed the report and took no further action. When asked years later why he had ignored the assessor's suggestion, he said he saw no reason to spend county money on demolition when nature would accomplish the same result eventually. Besides, he added, some places are best left alone. By 1960, the house had effectively ceased to exist as a functional structure. What remained was a shell, a frame, a suggestion of what had once stood there. The stairs had collapsed. The floors had rotted through in multiple places. The attic, exposed now to weather through gaps in the roof, was no longer accessible even if someone had wanted to climb up. The bed frame was still there, visible from ground level if you stood in the right position and looked up through the gaps in the ceiling. Rust had consumed most of the metal. It would last perhaps another decade before collapsing entirely. The notebooks, those that had been filed with county records, remained in storage. The cellar ledgers and the attic journals sat in boxes in the basement of the county courthouse, labeled and dated, but rarely examined. The historian's article had generated brief interest, but no sustained inquiry. The story, such as it was, had been told. There was nothing left to discover, or so it seemed. But in Blackwater itself, the house continued to exert a kind of presence, not through the supernatural, not through any manifestation that could be photographed or recorded, rather through the accumulated weight of knowing. Everyone in the township knew about the house. Everyone knew, at least in general terms, what it had been used for in the 1880s and 90s. Everyone knew about the Hartwell family and their sudden departure. Everyone knew about the journals and the person who had written them. And everyone, when asked, would say they didn't believe in such things. Ghosts, curses, houses that somehow retained the suffering that had occurred within them. These were not rational concepts. Yet everyone also agreed that the house was best avoided, not because of danger. The structure was dangerous, certainly, liable to collapse on anyone foolish enough to enter, but that wasn't why people stayed away. They stayed away because the house represented something they preferred not to confront. The capacity for cruelty that exists in seemingly normal circumstances, the ease with which people can be made invisible, the silence that communities maintain in the face of suffering they would rather not acknowledge. By the end of 1960, Blackwater had achieved a kind of equilibrium with the house. It stood at the end of Hickory Ridge Road, decaying at its own pace. Residents were advised not to go there, though the warning was rarely needed. Adults mentioned it only when necessary, usually when giving directions that required acknowledging landmarks. Out past the old Crenshaw place was how you described certain locations. No one said the house where they kept people, or the house where the woman wrote those journals. It was just the Crenshaw place, a neutral designation, history made deliberately vague. Ruth Caldwell, living in Springfield, never returned to Blackwater. She kept Margaret's diaries until her own death in 1960, at which point they passed to a family member, who donated them to the State Historical Society along with her mother's other papers. They remained there in the archives, available to researchers, though few requested access. The story they told was too personal, too painful, and ultimately too incomplete to serve any clear historical purpose. The cellar ledgers and attic journals still in county storage as of 1960 told a different kind of story, one of systematic isolation and methodical record-keeping. Someone, perhaps multiple someones over the years, used that house for a specific purpose. They brought people there who needed to be hidden. They kept records, they maintained order, and when the arrangement ended, they dispersed. Left no forwarding addresses, created no scandal, simply closed a door on that chapter and moved on to whatever came next. What happened to those people, the ones whose initials appear in the ledger, remains unknown. Some may have left after their stays concluded. Others may have stayed longer than intended. At least one E.M. stayed for 20 years, writing observations about dust and light and the sound of voices from below that she could never reach. Her entries suggest someone who was gradually erased by isolation, who lost the ability to distinguish between presence and absence, between living and simply persisting. The house, in its final years of semi-existence, served as a marker for all of this. It stood as physical evidence that such things happened, not in distant places or ancient times, but in rural Missouri, in a township of fewer than 300 people, in living memory. The attic where E.M. wrote her journals was accessible to anyone willing to climb a ladder. The cellar where the ledgers were hidden was just a cellar, common to thousands of houses across the country. There was nothing exceptional about the architecture or the location, only the use to which it had been put, and that, perhaps, was the most disturbing aspect. The house could have been anywhere. The people who ran it could have been anyone. The silence that protected it was the same silence that protected countless other arrangements in countless other places, where those with power decided what happened to those without it. The house in Blackwater was not unique. It was simply documented. By 1960, various proposals had been made regarding the property: demolition, preservation as a historical site, sale to private buyers. None advanced beyond discussion. The house continued to decay. By that point, much of the structure had deteriorated beyond repair. Hickory Ridge Road had become overgrown, barely passable even on foot. The forest was reclaiming the clearing. In another generation, it would be difficult to determine there had ever been a structure there at all. But the memory persists in county records, in academic articles, in the stories longtime residents of Blackwater tell when pressed about why certain roads are best left unexplored. The house may fade into physical non-existence. The journals may sit unread in archives. The ledgers may deteriorate beyond recovery. But the knowledge of what happened there, the understanding that people were brought to that isolated place and systematically made to disappear, either literally or through the erasure of their identities, that knowledge remains. And perhaps that is sufficient. Not justice, not resolution, just the acknowledgement that it happened, that it could happen, that the mechanisms which allowed it to happen, the social structures and personal choices and collective silences, are not unique to any particular time or place. They exist wherever people decide that some suffering is acceptable, some invisibility is convenient, some voices are better left unheard. The house at the end of Hickory Ridge Road taught this lesson to everyone who encountered it, to the Hartwell family who lived with the weight of that knowledge until it became unbearable, to the historian who documented it and then walked away, to Ruth, who carried her sister's final words for 35 years without sharing them, to the residents of Blackwater, who knew and chose collectively not to know. By 1960, the lesson had been learned. The house had served its purpose, both in its original function and in its afterlife as a reminder. What remained was simply a matter of time. How long before the last timber fell? How long before the forest completed its reclamation? How long before the last person who remembered the house firsthand passed away, taking their direct knowledge with them? The answer, it turned out, was not as long as some might have hoped. But neither was it short enough to constitute forgetting. The house persisted in memory long after it ceased to persist in form, and in that persistence, in that refusal to be entirely forgotten, it achieved a kind of permanence that no amount of physical decay could diminish. The attic trapdoor, opened in 1940, revealed more than a space and some journals. It revealed a capacity for organized cruelty that the community had worked hard to obscure. Once revealed, that knowledge could not be sealed away again, no matter how many nails were driven through the frame.